All right, so today we're going deep on something you've been asking about the Hazara people and like where they come from in Afghanistan.
Yeah, their origins.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story.
It is.
A lot more to it than meets the eye.
It really is.
So our mission is to really try to figure out, like, what did the evidence say? You know, do they go back a long time in the region?
Right.
And, you know, what have historians been saying for, you know, centuries past?
Right.
What does archaeology tell us?
Exactly. Yeah, we've got some pretty great sources, actually, to take a look at this question.
Yeah, cool. So where do we even begin? Like, what are the very first mentions?
Well, going back even 1,000 years ago, you've got like descriptions of distinct peoples living in the mountains.
Okay.
Between Ghazni and Balkh,
Right.
you know, which is right where the Hazara are today.
Wow.
And Ibn Hawkwal, who was this 10th century geographer, he noted, you know, their characteristics. He's like, oh, there's this group here.
Yeah.
And then you've got Masudi writing around the same time, another historian. He talks about the ancient inhabitants of the highlands between Herat and Sistan.
Okay.
And these people were really known for resisting invasions. So even back then, you can see, okay, there's like some established group in this very specific area.
Wow. So going back 1,000 years, we're already seeing like independent sources saying, hey, there's a unique group of people right here in this area.
Exactly. And it's not just them.
Oh, wow.
In the 12th century, Attar of Nishapur,
Okay.
he talks about this ancient group in the highlands between Persia and India.
Right.
So again, like geographically kind of in the sphere of the Hazara today. And then you fast forward even more to the 16th century, you've got Babur, who founded the Mughal Empire, right?
Yeah.
And in his very, very detailed Baburnama, he mentions, you know, distinct people in the mountains of Kabul and Ghazni long before he got there.
Right.
Which is really important because this guy was very meticulous about history and chronology.
Well,
So for him to be like, oh yeah, and there's these people who have always been here, that's really saying something.
yeah, for sure. For sure. Okay. So we see this like through line through all these different centuries
Right.
of different historians of different backgrounds saying, hey, look, there's people here.
Absolutely.
So that's really cool. And later on, too,
Yeah.
we've got Ibn Battuta
Oh, yeah.
in the 14th century, and he describes a distinct group in the mountains between Khwaraz and Hindustan.
Right. Between these huge empires.
Exactly. And then in the 15th century, Sharafuddin Ali Yazdi, his Zafarnama,
Yes.
mentions ancient inhabitants in these mountains
Before the Timurids came in.
before the Timurids. Wow.
Right.
So even before them, so we keep going further and further back and finding these accounts.
And if you go even further back, you've got people like Al-Balaturi
Okay.
back in the 9th century who talk about ancient groups in the mountains between Kabul and Gore before the Islamic conquest even. And then Yaqut Halmawi in the 13th century, he talks about this really long history of resistance coming from people in Gore and the areas around it. So it's like
Wow.
these mountains have been a place where people have dug in their heels for a very long time.
That's fascinating. Yeah. So from all these written sources, it's like really clear that they've been there for a long time.
Yeah.
So let's switch gears now
Okay.
and go from like the written word to
To the dirt.
archaeology.
Yes.
What does digging into the past actually show us?
Well, this is where things get really cool.
Yeah.
Bamiyan, in the heart of Hazarajat, is just this incredibly significant place.
Of course.
You've got those huge Buddha statues from the 5th, 6th centuries.
Right.
And that right there tells you that there was a really advanced civilization in the area, a long-term settlement.
Yeah.
And some people even say that the faces of these Buddhas look kind of like Hazara people.
Really?
Suggesting like a historical connection back to the pre-Islamic inhabitants of the region.
That's amazing. Like to think that maybe you can see that connection
I know, it's incredible.
across so much time.
It really is. So there's that, and then you've got other findings.
Okay.
Like Dar Akur Cave in Badakhshan, which is not too far from Hazarajat.
Okay.
They found evidence of people living there from the Middle Paleolithic all the way to the Neolithic, so like tens of thousands of years.
Wow.
And then in Hazar Sum in Samangan,
Yeah.
also near Hazarajat, they found Paleolithic and Neolithic stone tools. So clearly, you know, you had prehistoric communities living in those areas as well.
Wow. So all of this together from the written sources across centuries and from what we're digging up,
Exactly.
it seems like it really points to a long history in this area.
It really does.
But now we need to talk about this other theory that's been going around,
Okay, the Mongol theory.
the Mongol origin theory.
Yeah.
So how does that stack up against all this evidence?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
So yeah, some people point to some physical features and some linguistic things, and they say, oh, that must mean that they came from the Mongols.
Right.
But when you look at all the history and the archaeology, it really points to them being indigenous.
Cool.
For example, there's really no direct historical evidence saying that Genghis Khan or any other Mongol leader was like, hey, go settle permanently in Hazara.
Okay.
It's just not there. And remember those early historians we were talking about, like Ibn Hakwal and Masudi?
Yeah.
They describe groups who seem a lot like the Hazara living in central Afghanistan way before the Mongols even showed up in the 13th century.
Right.
And then you've got the archaeology in places like Bamiyan showing this really long cultural continuity going back to before Islam.
Right.
And that makes it hard to believe that the Mongols just came in and totally replaced the entire population.
Yeah, I see. So it's more likely that maybe there were some influences from the Mongols later on.
Exactly.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that they were the origin.
Exactly. It's two very different things.
Very interesting. So the Hazara region itself seems to play a really important role in all this.
It really does. It's their traditional homeland.
Yeah.
These really rugged mountains, deep valleys, even some lakes.
Wow.
And it's historically and culturally so important. You've got places like Bamiyan there that really demonstrate that connection to the land.
Yeah, for sure. So to wrap it all up, what's the big takeaway for our listeners today?
I think the biggest thing is that the historical and archaeological evidence really strongly suggests that the Hazara people have been in this region of Afghanistan for a really long time.
Yeah.
They were there before the Mongols, before all these big empires and migrations.
Right.
And while the Mongol theory is out there, the evidence really points to them being indigenous, especially to Hazara.
Yeah. Understanding the depth and continuity of that connection. It's a story that goes back, well, way further than a lot of people might think.
Yeah, let's jump right in. So before we even hit the 16th century, there are already hints about who was living in this area. Like, there's this 11th century Persian poet, Nasir Khusraw Balkhi, and he actually uses the word Hazara in his poetry.
That's right. And that's a really crucial point, because that predates the Mongol Empire by quite a bit.
So it wasn't Genghis Khan who brought the name with him?
Exactly. It really suggests that the term, or something very similar, was already being used for folks living there. Makes you wonder, where did it come from originally?
The plot thickens. And even earlier, like around 1010 AD, Ferdowsi Shahnameh, that epic Persian poem, it calls Hazarajat Berberistan. And it says it was an independent region within Turan.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Berberistan. I mean, right there you have a name that points to a distinct, recognized area, right?
Definitely. So even back then, 1,000 years ago, this area was its own thing, geographically for sure, but maybe ethnically too, who knows? And way before, the Mongols came into the picture.
Right.
And then we've got all these 10th century Arab and Persian geographers.
Oh yeah, they're full of details.
Okay, so Al-Muqaddasi, he called it Gaj al-Shar, Mountain of the King, and said it was governed by local chiefs. So it sounds like there was a settled population with its own way of doing things.
Makes sense. Then you have the Hudud Alam, another geographical text. It describes the people there as livestock breeders, farmers, cultivating both irrigated and non-irrigated land.
Yeah.
They were really working the land.
So they were really connected to that environment even back in the 10th century.
Yeah, it wasn't just like passing through. They were settled. And Isakri, another geographer, he mentions Gor, which is in northwestern Hazarajat. And he says it was inhabited by non-Muslims, but they were completely surrounded by Islamic territories.
So they were holding on to their own beliefs even then.
Seems like it. That religious difference in the 10th century, it just adds another layer to how unique this region was. And then there's Ibn Hosful, who describes Bamiyan, which becomes a really key area as the cold section of Khorasan.
But the fact that he even mentions it shows how important it was.
Definitely. So even before we get to the big Mongol impact, we're seeing all these consistent mentions of this distinct, settled region with its own identity.
Okay, so let's fast forward to the 16th century. This is where Hazara and Hazarajat as names really come into focus.
Right. And Babur, in his Baburnama, he talks about Hazaras invading his territory.
That sounds a little intense.
It does. But the key takeaway is they were clearly a known group, organized enough to launch an attack, not just scattered individuals.
Right. And when the Baburnama is summarized, it even mentions different Hazara tribes, like the Hazara of Sultan Masood and Turkmen Hazara. So there is a definitely social structure within the Hazara population.
Yeah, that's important. Now, Erotica Online, they mentioned something really interesting, Babur's reference to Niktara. These were people of Mongol origin, and he used the term Imak for Mongol tribes. So this points to a pretty strong Mongol presence in Hazarajat.
So the Mongol connection is starting to become clearer, right?
Absolutely. But Erotica Online also highlights that the term Hazara itself first appears in Babur's writings, specifically referring to people in the mountainous region west of Kabul. And moderndiplomacy.eu, they say that the first written use of Hazarajat is also in the Baburnama.
So the 16th century is really when these names become solidified, even if people were there much earlier.
Right. The written record might be more recent, but the actual people and their connection to the land, that goes back further, as we've seen.
Okay, so let's shift gears to archaeology. What does digging in the dirt tell us?
So much. In Bamiyan, in central Hazarajat, there's evidence of a major Buddhist center that thrived in the 4th and 5th centuries AD.
Long before the Mongols showed up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we're not talking small-time stuff here. The Bamiyan Buddhas, those huge statues, those were carved out of the rock in the 6th and 7th centuries. They stood for over 1,000 years. That shows you the scale and longevity of the culture there.
Wow, 1,000 years. That's incredible.
It is. And inside the caves, near those Gudas, they discover these amazing wall paintings. And get this, they've been identified as the world's earliest oil paintings. They date back to the 7th century. So that's advanced art and technology in the region.
It's like a whole other level of sophistication.
Absolutely. And Bamiyan was a key stop on the Silk Road, a major Buddhist religious site under the Kushan Empire starting in the 2nd century AD. And it continued to be important for centuries, even through the Islamic conquests in 770 AD and under Ghaznavid Turk rule in 977 AD.
So a lot of different groups and cultures passed through that area.
A real crossroads. And even Harvard, they note that today the Bamiyan Valley is the largest province in Hazarajat and has the highest concentration of Hazara people. So there's a direct link from the ancient past to the present.
Wow, so much history layered right on top of each other. Okay, but there's archaeology beyond Bamiyan, right?
Oh, yeah. In Hazar Sum, which is in Samangan province, they found Stone Age tools like Upper Paleolithic and Neolithic from 10,000 to 7,000 BC. So people have been living in Hazarajat for a very, very long time.
That's going way back.
It is. And over in Gore, Lithuanian archaeologists in 2007 and 2008, they uncovered remains of settlements that date back to 5,000 BC. That's like the oldest stuff found there so far.
So people were settling down and building communities way back then.
That's what it looks like. It wasn't just nomadic hunters and gatherers. This was organized living.
Okay, so now let's get to the genetics. What do the genes tell us about the Hazara people?
Well, the Hazaras, they're genetically a mixed group with connections to Turkic, Mongol, and Iranian populations. And you can see some of the Mongol influence in their physical features, which probably came from later periods.
Right, so it's not all from the ancient past.
Exactly. Yeah. There are layers to this story. Now, there's a study from 2012, Haber et al. They did this genetic analysis and found that Afghan Hazaras, they fall somewhere between East Asian and Middle Eastern European groups. And they're genetically distinct from both Pashtuns and Tajiks.
Interesting.
Yeah. And another study, Mazavia et al. From 2019, they found that modern Hazaras are actually genetically closer to Turkic-speaking populations from northwestern China, like the Uyghur, Kazakh, and Kyrgyz people. And they have a significant amount of Mongol-related ancestry.
So the genetic picture is pretty complex, right?
It is. Yeah. But it makes sense given the history of the region, all the mixing and mingling of different groups over time.
Right. But it's fascinating how genetics can kind of back up what the history and archaeology are telling us.
Absolutely. You know, Di Cristofaro et al., in 2013, they suggested that the Hindu Kush region wasn't really a source of distinct native populations, but more like a meeting point for different gene flows.
So it's a melting pot.
Yeah, exactly. It makes the whole area super interesting from a genetic standpoint.
Right. And even Archaeological Online, they brought up the Heplites, a Turk-Mongol group that was present in modern-day Afghanistan in the 5th and 6th centuries. They thought maybe they contributed something to the Hazara origins.
It's possible.
Yeah.
And a lot of sources confirm this close relationship between Hazaras and Uzbeks in Afghanistan, with those links to Turkic, Mongol, and Iranian peoples. Haber et al. Also found a significant East Asian component in Hazara Y DNA, which adds another piece of the puzzle.
Wow. So it really is this whole tapestry of different influences woven together.
You got it.
So when we consider all this evidence, those early historical mentions, the rich archaeology in Hazarajat, and those complex genetic connections, what does it really tell us about the Hazara people's connection to this land?
It tells a powerful story, I think. It tells us they've been there for a very, very long time. They have deep roots in this historically dynamic area. And while the Mongol influence is definitely there in their genetics and some of the historical accounts, those older historical and archaeological layers suggest that there was already a continuous habitation and connection to Hazarajat that spans back thousands of years. It involved interactions with various groups over time, so it's not just about a 13th century arrival, it's about a much deeper, longer story.
It really challenges the simple narratives, right?
It does. It adds so much nuance and complexity to the story of the Hazara people.
Well, thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive. It's been really fascinating.
My pleasure. I'm glad we could explore this together.
And to you, the listener, I mean, thinking about this long history, this resilience in a region that's seen its fair share of turmoil, how does this broader context, how does it shape your understanding of the Hazara people's current situation and their identity? It's definitely something to think about. Until our next deep dive, take care.